Hello, welcome. Welcome to the Hood Museum of Art event. My name is John Stomberg. I'm the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S director of the Hood Museum. We are pleased to present the seventh in the Hood series of annual lectures that revolve around the epic of American civilization, the internationally recognized mural by José Clemente Orozco, located on the ground level of the Dartmouth College Library. These lectures have been made possible by an endowment from the MANTON Foundation, which promotes scholarship on and provides care and conservation for the Orozco mural at Dartmouth. We would like to express our appreciation and gratitude to the MANTON Foundation for their ongoing support of these amazing murals. Note, too, that in 2014, we celebrated an important landmark, the conferring of national landmark status to the epic of American civilization by the National Park Service. Our speaker this evening, Associate Professor of Art History, Mary Coffey, specializes in the history of Mexican visual culture, with an emphasis on Mexican muralism and the politics of the exhibition. After graduate work in art history and cultural studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Professor Coffey taught at Pomona College and NYU before finding her true calling and joining the faculty at Dartmouth. Since coming to Hanover, she has been a tireless and productive teacher and scholar, an affiliated professor with the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies programs, and the Women and Gender Studies program. Professor Coffey has taught everything from the introductory survey of Western art history to specialized courses on public art, Orozco, Fluxus, and museum practice. At the same time, she has remained an active and very important contributor to the fields of American art history, Latin American culture studies, and museum studies. She has published essays on a broad range of visual culture topics, from Mexican folk art to motorcycles and eugenics exhibitions. So I'm really pleased to remind you, too, that her much celebrated book, How a Revolutionary Art Became Official Culture, Museums, Murals, and the Mexican State, published by Duke University Press in 2012, received the Charles Rufus Moray Prize from the College Art Association for a distinguished book published in art history. And very soon, wait with bated breath, we will have the results of her most recent thinking on Dartmouth's mural when her forthcoming book from Duke University Press arrives. That book, Orozco's American Epic, Myth, History, and the Melancholy of Race, is sure to be the definitive study on the Dartmouth mural and set a high bar in general for the study of art history. We could not ask for a more knowledgeable scholar for the 2018 Manton Lecture. Please join me in welcoming our friend and colleague, Professor Mary Coffey.
Thank you. So thank you so much, John, for those remarks or that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here and to see all my students, as well as all my friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for coming out on such a rainy night to hear my latest musings on this mural, which I've been musing about now for 14 years. Before I begin, I want to give thanks to a couple of people, and I want to begin by just acknowledging the Abenaki people on whose lands we're gathered at this moment. I think that's appropriate at this occasion. I also want to give my thanks to the museum and to the Manton Foundation, who have been such vigorous supporters of my work from the moment I arrived in the Manton, from the moment it was endowed. They, in fact, invited me to give the inaugural lecture, and that was the seed that became the book. So I owe a lot to that organization and that foundation. And finally, I want to be sure that I acknowledge all of my students, many of whom are not here. They've graduated and moved on in their lives. The book that John mentioned is dedicated to my students because it is as a consequence of all these years of teaching the mural and sort of engaging with my students' questions, with their observations, and also with their investments in the mural, that a lot of my thinking has been shaped. And in fact, a lot of my sort of original understandings of the mural or ways of thinking about the mural have been kind of fundamentally turned on their head as a consequence of my students' involvement in the mural and helping me to see the mural from the standpoint less as a scholar of Mexican cultural history, which is the standpoint I brought to the murals, and more from the standpoint of US American politics. And that's really the transition that I sort of write my way through in the book. So I want to be sure to acknowledge them. And finally, the book is also dedicated to 4 scholars who are also not here, but whose influence on my work and friendship has been particularly important for this project. And they are Mishana Goman, Lourdes Gutierrez Najera, Amy Bong, and Rena Goldthry. So this is dedicated to them, as is the book. I'm going to turn the lights down. Okay, so I want to frame my remarks tonight with 2 texts. The first is a quote from Jean Genet's 1959 play Le Nègre that the artist Glenn Ligon has stenciled repeatedly on canvas in his untitled study number 2 from 1992. It reads, "You're turning us into specters before our very eyes, but we're going to haunt you. You're turning us into specters before our very eyes, but we are going to haunt you." The second is a quote from the Mexican artist José Clemente Orozco's autobiography, in which he describes his time at Dartmouth when, between 1932 and 1934, he painted his 24-panel mural cycle, The Epic of American Civilization, in the basement of Baker Library. In this account, he comments on the college's founding, relying less on historical fact and more on a popular lyric turned drinking song penned by Dartmouth alumnus Richard Hovey. While Orozco was wrong when he argued that Wheelock's civilizing endeavor resulted in the annihilation of the region's Indians, he was likely responding to the fact that between 1900 and 1969, despite the college's founding charter and mission, Dartmouth enrolled approximately 30 indigenous students, many for only a year or 2. During his 2 years at Dartmouth, it is unlikely that he encountered any indigenous students or local residents. However, it is quite likely that he witnessed the student body's penchant for playing Indian. In his study of Native Americans at Dartmouth, Colin Calloway notes that during the 1920s and 30s, the imagined Indian took the place of real ones. In response to this US American Indian imaginary, Orozco devised his mural around the theme of indigenous priority, achievement, and prophecy. What Orozco did not know, however, was that enslaved Black labor had also been central to the college's foundation and its early years. He thereby makes no reference to the disappearance of Brister, Exeter, Chloe, Caesar, Lavinia, Archelaus, Peggy, and an unnamed child, the enslaved people Wheelock brought to the Hanover Plain, a few of whom were also enrolled in his charity school. And I'm just giving propers to my former colleague, Craig Wilder, whose book really helped me to understand this history pretty late in my Dartmouth career, I have to say. The invisibility of this history within the college's official narrative of its foundations is mirrored in the silence on slavery and Black experience in period accounts of the American epic. As with the likes of James Treslow Adams' The American Epic, which was published in 1931 to much acclaim, or Herbert Eugene Bolton's The Greater American Epic, and a very famous address he gave to the American Historical Society in 1933, there is no mention of the institution of slavery in Orozco's mural, a conspicuous absence, to say the least, in a mural dedicated to a critique of colonialism in the Americas. So my comments today are drawn from chapters 3 and 4 from my forthcoming book. In this book, I argue that the cycle is a dialectical image, and my students and I were just talking about this today, a term I take from German cultural historian and philosopher Walter Benjamin. In this mural, Orozco, I argue, has constellated the conquest of the Americas and American modernity in order to critically engage the cultural politics of nationalism in both post-revolutionary Mexico as well as U.S.-American claims regarding settlement and national progress. Exploiting the room's architectural features, Orozco structures a comparison between ancient and modern America, with the first half dedicated to scenes depicting the myth of Quetzalcoatl, and that's this half of the mural. And this is the reserve desk here that marks the break in the architectural space. And the second half, scenes of America's descent into modernity, rendered as a kind of horror show. It is through this provocative juxtaposition of myth and history, Anglo and Hispano-American conceptions of national history, that Orozco situates the modern viewer. And I suggest in the book that the place from which the entire mural's dialectic sort of unfolds is from this space that is opened up between the so-called ancient and modern Americas. So Orozco situates the modern viewer within the crisis of post-colonial nation formation, a crisis he demands that she take on as though it were a concern of her own, as a necessary precondition for any redemption of the violence and that founded modern American civilization. Today, I'll be focusing on the modern half of the mural, paying particular attention to the first four panels: Cortez and the Cross, the Machine, Anglo America, and Hispano America, as well as to the supplement, Modern Industrial Man, located across from the reserve desk. The allusion to decryption in my title is drawn from Rajana Khanna, who argues that the decolonial work of melancholic nationalism lies in its capacity to decrypt the specters of colonialism that haunt post-colonial national formations. In that spirit, I explore the encryption of Blackness within Orozco's epic, despite the fact that epic makes no reference to Black experience in the Americas. I argue that it is haunted by what An-Ling Chang calls the shadow of the lost object, who are the buried but formative ghosts in the Constitution as a founding document and in the Constitution of American national history and identity. To decrypt Blackness in Orozco's epic, I read the mural symptomatically for encryptions of what lies without, or that is beyond, both US and Mexican national representation. I've been aided in this task by the many US-American students and visitors I have toured through this mural who routinely interpret the figures of Anglo America as zombies and the modern industrial man as Black. These are identifications I initially viewed as misidentifications, misunderstandings of the mural that I have come to see as sort of central because they, in a sense, tap into something that's encrypted within the mural but not explicitly expressed. I ask how these identifications speak not only to the figure of the slave encrypted within US-American discourses of freedom, but more significantly, how they voice the role that anti-Blackness, a legacy that Lourdes Garcia Peña attributes to a fear of Haiti within the Americas, plays in the violent bordering of both Anglo and Hispano America and their respective racial imaginaries. So the modern wing begins with Cortez and the Cross. Here, Cortez stands impassively amidst the destruction of Mesoamerican civilization and a heap of dead bodies. He's accompanied by a friar who stakes an enormous cross into the rubble, announcing the spiritual conquest of the Americas. The scenario then jumps in time to the 20th century with the Machine, a highly compressed landscape of industrial machinery that feeds off the destroyed bodies at Cortez's feet. Anglo and Hispano America follow. Orozco characterizes Anglo America as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. We see children issuing from a white schoolhouse/Protestant church to gather around a stern schoolmistress. To her right, businessmen in gray flannel suits and frowning blonde women gather for a town hall meeting before a red barn. A collection of atomized persons, they stare dourly but without purpose toward an absence at the heart of their gathering. This is the Walking Dead, or these are the Walking Dead, who are often characterized by students as zombies because their affectless gathering suggests subjugated agency, a key feature of the zombie trope. Anglo America's grid-like order gives way to the spiraling chaos of Hispano-America. In this panel, architecture collapses as businessmen, politicians, and generals vie for gold coins that spill from a large sack. Orozco pictures an armed peasant standing dead center, posed against his rifle, ready for purposeful action. However, his imminent death at the hands of a U.S. American general reveals that he too is a walking dead man. So with the first 4 panels of the modern sequence, Orozco demonstrates that violence is what constitutes community. Ricardo Esposito observes that the mythical violence of origin stories is fraternal in nature, arguing that it is not difference, but rather, quote, indifference that brings human beings together, end quote. However, history painting in Mexico would suggest that it is difference that matters, for those images consistently stage a scene in which it is a stranger and not a member of the family who kills. Moreover, it is through this killing that strangers become family, joined by the womb of the same mother, rather than starting out as brothers only to have the kinship sundered by fratricide, like Romulus and Remus, which is what Esposito is thinking about when he talks about foundational fictions. And here I'm showing you just sort of 2 classic examples of a Mexican foundational fictions. One from the 19th century, in which, as you can see, the Dominican friar Bartolomeo de las Casas becomes the kind of surrogate husband, if you will, to this indigenous woman whose husband has been slayed as within the context of the conquest. And then Orozco's sort of inscription or rescripting of this foundational fiction using the figures of Cortez and Malinche, Cortez's indigenous courtesan / wife / slave, and they become sort of the foundational parents in a pairing that comes at the expense, again, of another indigenous male figure. And so this trope is pretty typical throughout Latin America, and it's certainly consistent within the Mexican-American visual record. So because Esposito ignores the colonial theater, he asserts that it is radical equality that constitutes what he calls bare community, to indicate the original indifference that comprises our relation in common. It is the very sameness, the indifference of community, he argues, that propels the construction of boundaries in an attempt to stabilize an inside and an outside of community. Boundaries seek to establish an us and a them. They can both confer an identity upon the community, but also keep the community from falling back into an undifferentiated mass and violent chaos of an original communitas. The security of boundaries come, of course, at a very high price, the subordination of life to the law of the sovereign and or the state. This negative identification is what Esposito calls the immunitary response of the modern state. Immunitas, he argues, sets up protective borders against what is outside, as well as the threats that inhere within community. So a way I like to think about this, just to sort of translate Esposito's kind of high theory here, is if you're familiar with shows like The Walking Dead, for instance, and I'm going to keep using zombie motifs here. In The Walking Dead, of course, all humans, whether they're living or dead, are infected with this virus that will ultimately convert them into zombies. And one of the ways that the living humans attempt to sort of immunize themselves against this existential threat is by consistently walling themselves into exclusionary communities. And the show consistently uses architectural forms or institutional forms that we're familiar with: a prison, a factory, a hospital, and planned communities. Those are sort of the sort of architectural forms of this immunitary conception of community that attempts to draw a line between the self and the other in order to secure the community from the threats that seek to sort of render it undifferentiated again from the dead. And of course, one of the things that the show consistently rehearses is that that threat is never effectively mitigated. In fact, they are constantly falling apart. These communities are constantly falling apart, both because of external threats, but also because of internal threats, the ways in which the immunitary impulse comes to sort of haunt, if you will, like chickens coming home to roost, the very community that it's supposed to secure. So, Now, Alexander Whaley counters Esposito's account by arguing that, quote, there exists no such thing as an absolute biopolitical substance because the racializing assemblages of coloniality have so dehumanized the colonized that they lie beyond the very category of the human and therefore are differentiated from human communitas at the outset. This helps us to appreciate why Orozco has lumped the victims of Cortez's conquest into a pile of mere flesh at the outset of the modern half of the mural, for it is the political violence of the colonial modern matrix that differentiates and hierarchizes humanity, assigning the status of man, capital M man, to the white Western subject, here represented by Cortez, and relegating subjugated peoples such as Amerindians and enslaved Africans to the category of mere flesh. Esposito's insights, however, about community and immunity are compelling, especially with regard to Orozco's characterization of the two Americas in his epic. Not only does Orozco foreground the violent foundation of the law through the Spanish conquest of the Americas, but also his Anglo and Hispano America seem to emblematize the ordered immunitary state on the one hand and the chaotic threat of bare life and the bare community on the other. By situating the emergence of the modern biopolitical state in the conquest of the Americas, Orozco acknowledges what Esposito effectively ignores. That is, the violence of the modern state has its origins in colonial violence and its racializing assemblages. So, Anglo America, with its rigid geometry and relentless whiteness, presents a vision of the racialized nation state wherein all externalized differences have been expelled in order to secure WASP boundaries. The apparent absence of violence in this scene would seem to confer a kind of exceptionalism on the US, distinguishing it from, on the one hand, the violence of the Spanish conquest that's on one side of this mural, and on the other, from Hispano-America or post-revolutionary Mexico in the 1930s. And yet Orozco argues that Anglo-America derives its identity negatively. Recall the absence at the center of the composition. It is neither Spanish in origin nor like Hispano-America now. It has erected boundaries, established difference via the Black legend and a WASP imperial social imaginary that brokers no brown or Catholic contaminants. Similarly, in order to its order has been achieved at the expense of freedom, for no one in this gloomy scene seems to express the autonomy and individuality that modern sovereignty is supposed to confer upon the members of its community. Orozco therefore refuses the exceptionalism of the settler state. By re-articulating Anglo-America's community to the violence of Spanish Empire, which is a historical violence that is both internal and external to the United States, and to the violence of the political border that insists upon a difference between Anglo and Hispano-America. From this differentiation of the American communitas into two Americas, racism and exploitation follow. So through his zombified citizens, Orozco seems to invoke the white zombie fetish of the 1930s U.S. America, when, after the U.S. invasion and subsequent occupation of Haiti in 1914, the figure of the zombie morphed into a loaded signifier put in the service of various Caucasian fears and racism. Anne Cordas tracks the zombie through American popular culture in this period, arguing that it figures white fears of blacks, miscegenation, immigrants, and the new woman. It's doing a lot of work in the 1930s. So in period films like The White Zombie from 1932, white women are possessed by racially ambiguous zombie masters and converted into affectless white slaves, who simultaneously represent the anxieties of white audiences over the sexual transgressions of the new woman and the repression of her opposite, the desexed Victorian woman. Orozco's configuration of Anglo-America through the desexed figure of the stern schoolmarm captures both of these fears. Likewise, his characterization of the school children, businessmen, and rural citizens as dead-eyed drones anticipates the zombie as capital trope that we find in contemporary subaltern discourses that, quote, put it to work in opposition to the dominance of first world economic models. And here I'm thinking of films like Sleep Dealer, where the zombie represents the ways in which certain configurations of neoliberal capital suck the life out of and turn, in this case, Mexican workers into dead-eyed drones, the Walking Dead. So, and what of Hispano-America then? What are we to make of Orozco's image of its chaotic violence? It's clear that Orozco depicts Mexico as a victim of both internal and external corruption. However, his focus on the revolutionary peasant is significant. The guerrilla, as an emblem of popular struggle and eruption of violence without a master ideology, represents the refusal of the law of the sovereign, originating in the Spanish conquest and continuing through Mexico's post-independence history of liberal governance. Without the safeguards of the state's monopoly on violence, society falls back into the chaos of bare community. Orozco's guerrilla is an indio or a mestizo whose very identity as such is rooted in the racial assemblages that emerged through the Spanish administration of its New World colonies. As the only dark-skinned protagonist in the modern half of the mural, he figures the threat of racial violence that fostered Anglo American fears about the Mexican Revolution, a recapitulation of the fear of Haiti that overtook slave economies like the United States and Spain following the slave revolt that began in 1791 and led to Haitian independence in 1804. This fear, that is the fear of Haiti or racialized revolutions in the Americas, persisted well into the 20th century and was reactivated in the popular imaginary in the U.S. After the U.S. occupation of Haiti enabled William Seabrook to travel there and undertake what he passed off as an ethnography of Vodun rituals. It was Seabrook in The Magic Island, this book from 1929, who converted the zombie, the Haitian zombie with an I, a figure associated with both powerful spirits of African origin and a leader of a slave revolt, into the zombie, Z-O-M-B-I-E, a reanimated corpse, and the figure we're familiar with in the United States. So Orozco's guerrilla, while unambiguously a Mexican revolutionary, can also be read as the revenant zombie of U.S. America's fear of Haiti and the revolution and revolt that it threatened. Both Mexico and Haiti were associated with revolutions undertaken by racialized and colonized subjects, and both posed a threat to U.S. capital and suppositions of racial order. This reading is suggested, moreover, by the fact that the guerrilla is about to be assassinated by a U.S. general. He is therefore literally an animate corpse. Following Wehelier, Stephen Pokonarski argues that the zombie, quote, as a figure already caught up in theorizations of bare life, enmeshed in existential and political zones of indistinction between life and death, human and monster, the camp and the colony, etc., and entangled with a profound history of racism and exploitation, offers a unique window to see how life is made vulnerable and violence justified, end quote. In this formulation, the zombie signifies vulnerable life, helping us to see how power is consolidated, sovereignty is validated, and vulnerability is disavowed through the othering and making vulnerable of groups marked by race. So I'm showing you a still from The Walking Dead. And again, one of the things in Pokonarski's argument is he argues that shows like The Walking Dead, which of course deracinate the trope of the zombie, also demonstrate the ways in which the very victims of whatever it is that caused the zombie outbreak also become its victims, and that the violence that is routinely enacted against these Walking Dead is justified, if you will, by the fact that they have been constituted as an other and a threat. And he sees that operating in other realms of society. So in this sense, Orozco's guerrilla suggests that racialization is how the immunitary state of Anglo America not only seeks to secure itself against the threats of those it has colonized, but also the ways that the very vulnerability of those groups with respect to Anglo-American history and policy comes to justify the violence enacted by U.S. American state against them. It's just a contemporary meme about our current immigration debates. So I think this has become obvious in our current political environment, where the racialization of migrants fleeing the chaos and violence of US-backed civil war in the Northern Triangle has enabled a deadly immunopolitical reaction, whereby they have become construed as the threat to the community of US American citizenship, imagined implicitly and explicitly as white, or at the very least as not Latin. So the imminent death of the revolutionary at the hands of a U.S. general acknowledges this long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, as well as the violence enacted against poor Mexicans through exploitation of migrant workers and the demonization and deportation of illegal aliens from the U.S. body politic. However, rather than depicting him as weak docile, or pitiful, like the figure of black servitude in many filmic zombies of the period, Orozco recalls the power and rebellion associated with the Haitian zombie, Z-O-M-B-I. Okay. Orozco's epic also engages with the contemporary popular discourse about the so-called two Americas, and this is where his titles come from. One of various period iterations of Pan-Americanism. His rendering of both Anglo and Hispano-America have much in common with Waldo Frank's contemporaneous arguments about the so-called two American half-worlds in his 1931 book, America Hispana, A Portrait and a Prospect. In America Hispana, he characterizes Anglo-Saxon America, that's his term, as materialistic and technologically developed with an atomized conception of the person that has lost its organic connection with the land and the creative spirit. Orozco's homogenized gathering of men in gray flannel suits and women with severely upswept hair suggests precisely the kind of immunized body politic that Frank attributes to the, quote, self-assertion and other annihilation that subtends U.S. America's Protestant ethos. And I should just make clear, if you don't know Waldo Frank, he wrote a million books. He's U.S. American. He's making this critique from within the United States as a U.S. Protestant, as a U.S. citizen. Moreover, the patch of wheat, unnaturalistically confined to the composition's grid logic, gives voice to Frank's concerns about how Protestantism has rationalized the capitalist exploitation of man and nature in the United States. It is an emblem of nature subjected to capitalist America's, quote, machine culture, his words. America Hispana, on the other hand, argues Frank, is spiritually strong but lacks leadership and morale. Quote, whatever his condition, Frank asserts, the Hispano-American has direct contact with his soul and his soil. He elaborates, quote, if he has remained the simple Indian or Negro, the contact with soul and soil is intense and can become almost maniacal with oppression. The Indian's experience may be his archaic self-awareness as an integer of the clan, whose body is the communal acre. However elementary and arrested, it is the seed of creation against the coming of some spiritual spring which shall warm it and make it grow, end quote. If U.S. Americans are individualistic and dissociated from soul and soil, their Hispanic counterparts, due to the vestiges of archaic lifeways, the so-called Indian and Negro, is connected to the communal acre. Here, Orozco's image of Hispano-America ratifies Frank's vision of this American half-world, insofar as he emphasizes indigenous popular revolt through the figure of the peasant warrior. His warrior's resemblance to Emiliano Zapata articulates popular struggle specifically to the agrarian platform of Zapatismo. So, characterizing the two American half-worlds as body and spirit, respectively, Frank asserts that, quote, in one place there is order that lacks life, in the other there is life that lacks order, end quote. For Frank, the solution to the problem of the American half-worlds is an epiphanic union wherein the seed of America Hispana's spiritual wholeness lodges itself within the sterile but solid body of the United States, quote, taking unto itself the energy of the body and bursting it in transfiguration, end quote. He really says these things. Frank's discourse is both prophetic and sexualized, wherein the violence of revolution is achieved metaphorically through the insemination of the North by the South or through an ecstatic sexual union between Anglo and Hispano America. And again, I think we might think about these two figures as, again, a rescripting of this foundational fiction that I rehearsed for you a little bit earlier. In Frank's estimation, both the Indian and the Negro embody Hispano-America, right? They're in Hispano-America, not Anglo-America. And both are understood to be excluded from Anglo-America. While Frank locates indigeneity and negritude in Hispano-America, his promotion of this epiphanic union of the two American half-worlds reveals the melancholic dynamic of white racial formation. For this lament about Anglo-America is rooted in its simultaneous exclusion of and desire to retain the denigrated remnants created in the formation of American identity. Frank's answer to the vexed question of liberation and racial exclusion is to project U.S. America's externalized, racialized others onto Hispano-America, only to conjure them back to foster the cause of American progress. But their return can only be configured as a foreign invasion, a violent seduction of Anglo-America that at once breaks her, while supposedly making her whole again. So, Lorgia Garcia Peña argues that both the denigration of Blackness and its identification with liberty and freedom were generated by the Haitian Revolution and the anti-Haitian sentiments it produced within the U.S. Not only did a fear of Haiti structure emergent conceptions of U.S. Blackness, but it also incentivized the United States' political, economic, and military expansion into Latin America, a process that was, quote, foundational to the production of Latinos as a U.S. racial category and consequently to the process of U.S. cultural bordering that continues to render Latinos as foreign to this day, end quote. While Latinx identity as a category did not exist as such in the 1930s, Orozco's experience as a Mexican living in the United States subjected him to the cultural bordering that renders all Mexicans as foreign nationals regardless of their place of birth. Moreover, Orozco's U.S. stay coincided with one of the high points of xenophobia, with the imposition of immigration restrictions and the forced repatriation of Mexicans during the Depression. While he may have found solace in Frank's praise for Hispano-America, it is unlikely he could have seen himself in either Anglo America's machine body or Hispano-America's Indians and Negroes. So Orozco's epic deviates ultimately from Frank's vision of the two Americas, for Orozco's imagery mitigates against the possibility of a reproductive romance. Rather than endorsing mestizaje, Anglo and Hispano-America refuse it. Orozco's gendered geopolitical proxies intimate the end of the reproductive line. The immunitary impulse that has created two Americas from one communitas leads not to procreative union, but rather to a thanato-political fate. This fate is underscored by the following panels: Gods of the Modern World and Modern Human Sacrifice, where skeletal figures give birth to stillborn fetuses or are buried beneath the pomp of national commemoration. And while these panels speak broadly to the phenomenon of modern nation states, their constellation with scenes of the Spanish conquest, industry, and the racializing discourses of Pan-Americanism implicate the general questions of the sort of death politics of racist nationalism into Orozco's more specific critique of history, progress, and justice within the Americas. Orozco's coupling of the disparate historical events of the conquest and interwar Pan-Americanism demonstrates that the thanatopolitics of the modern nation-state can be traced back to the colonial modern matrix and its racializing assemblages. Following Walter Benjamin, Esposito argues that the law should not be, quote, understood as the abolition of violence, but rather as the modern transposition of the ancient ritual of the sacrifice of a victim, end quote. The immunitary dialectic that divides communitas into sovereign states is always rooted in an act of violence, and the establishment of juridical order in its aftermath can only be enforced through the very violence it seeks to banish. Sovereign power both wields and suspends justice. It declares war and exports violence from within its own borders outside. Thus, when Orozco depicts the anonymous soldier in Modern Human Sacrifice, he recalls not only the ancient human sacrifice of the Aztecs across the corridor, but also the victimization of Amerindians in Cortez and the Cross, whose sacrifice gave rise to the imposition of a new sovereign law in the Americas. Okay. You're turning us into specters before our very eyes, but we're going to haunt you. At this point, I want to shift to the modern industrial man, for he conjures the many exclusions of raced populations within national colonial representation. The very possibility of this figure's blackness tells us something about how Orozco was navigating the color line in the U.S., as well as his own status as an artist within a cultural project that approximated some of the most anxious features of labor under industrializing capitalism. The sequence of sketches Orozco prepared for the central panel of Modern Industrial Man reveals that the artist modeled the figure after a Dartmouth student. This square-jawed man sports a crew cut and wears what looks like a sport coat or possibly a letterman's jacket. Orozco switched gears in the preparatory process, however. Subsequent sketches reveal that he set about changing not only the racial identity of the figure, but also his class. The resultant figure's shoulders are more rounded. He dons a worker's cap and what appear to be the shapeless coveralls and black boots of the worker. His face has been broadened with prominent cheekbones, a wider, flatter nose, and almond-shaped eyes, as opposed to the more angular features in the earlier sketch. Most conspicuously, the figure's bare hands have become gloved. These gloves link this figure to the laboring men in adjacent panels, who are also wearing gloves. They too wear gloves to do their work. But in the central panel, the gleaming whiteness of the glove stands out within a composition that is otherwise somber hued. Moreover, they contrast with the man's skin tone, calling even greater attention to his racialized physiognomy. And I have to say, this is one of the most frequent questions I get. Why is he wearing white gloves? Why is he wearing white gloves? So the modern industrial man indexes Mexico's revolutionary cultural politics and its emphasis on the urban worker. He is recognizable through an iconographic conventions that became consolidated in the mid-1920s by artists, photographers, and printmakers working in league with Mexico's working class organizations. This archetype is nearly always depicted in blue overalls and wielding some kind of tool. Blue denim overalls were also iconic features of the radical artist, who increasingly crafted himself as a skilled manual laborer rather than as an intellectual. They organized themselves into a union, the Mexican Union of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors, and asked for laborers' wages from their government patrons. They published a manifesto in El Machete, the union's official newspaper, in which they asserted that campesinos, that's peasants, city workers, the proletariat, and the Indian soldier were on their side. And they pledged to socialize artistic expression by making monumental rather than bourgeois art. While these artists sought to anchor their call for a collective public art in the authenticity of the indigenous past, their emphasis on collectivity was equally derived from the nature of industrial labor. And I think it's important to note that they ended their manifesto, which is largely about indigenous culture as Mexico's sort of true culture, with a call for the world proletariat to unite. So this tells you what their sort of political allegiances were. The union's commitment to Mexico's rural and urban working classes is borne out in the imagery of public murals during this period. For example, in Rivera's National Palace mural, we see a large number of dark-skinned workers clad in blue overalls and engaged in radicalizing acts. They wield hammers, they strike, they organize, and they educate their brethren. And in each instance, their action is clearly guided by orthodox Marxist principles. And of course, Marx is famously depicted holding up the Communist Manifesto, and this figure over here is also holding the Capital by Marx. And so there's very explicit connection here in this mural between the urban proletariat and the extent to which they're being sort of educated by Marx and implicitly by Rivera, who's providing these texts for them. By comparison, Orozco's modern industrial man has set his hammer aside and picked up a book. Unlike Rivera's workers, who are ministered to by Karl Marx, he is a self-edifying individual. While the figure in Modern Industrial Man does not wear the telltale blue denim overalls of the urban worker, his nondescript clothing might be interpreted as the kind of coveralls Orozco often wore when painting his murals. So, thus far, I've been treating this racialized worker as though he were unquestionably meant to be read as an indigenized worker, along the lines of this Mexican iconography. However, U.S. American visitors more often read him as African American. The slippage between reading him as indigenous or black opens up an unexplored homology between the primitivism that undermines Mexican artistic indigenismo, that is the identification and appropriation of indigenous culture in Mexico, and racial stereotype in the U.S. The white gloves that the modern industrial man so prominently displays are not only signifiers of the laboring classes, they are also signifiers of what Nick Salmon calls vestigial blackface. Scholars of blackface minstrelsy have commented on the ubiquity of white gloves as part of the conventionalized costume of the blackface performer. Dandified figures wore gloves as a sign of affected gentility. White gloves signified the very absurdity of black aspiration, and within this genre, they mark the exclusion of black subjects from all things civilized. Now, Nick Salmon demonstrates how this blackface trope migrated to many of the recurring cartoon characters of the period, such as Mickey Mouse. This is sort of the classic moment when American animation bursts on the scene and becomes a kind of international cause célèbre. Some scholars and animators have insisted that these characters wear white gloves because they were easier to draw than hands. Salmon, however, maintains that white gloves were markers of minstrelsy. As the industry advanced and characters became more standardized, these markers of minstrelsy became vestigial, that is, carrying but rarely referring directly to the tradition itself. So in this sense, Salmon distinguishes the animated minstrel, Mickey Mouse, from the vicious racial caricatures of African Americans that also populated the genre. Both draw upon the blackface performance of African American life, but the latter are meant to be read as black, while the former mobilize a host of ideas linked to blackness without referring to any specific historical figure or circumstance. Eric Lott argues that one of the many ideas embedded in minstrelsy is a white working class protest against wage labor. Salmon follows that early animators too were reacting to the rapid industrialization of their craft when they invented disobedient recurring characters. Quote, faced with depersonalization within emerging industrial modes of production, yet clinging to a craft model of production, animators created a commodity that appeared to speak back to its creators and assert its independence from the social and material order of its making, end quote. So in early animated sketches, like this one here, one would often see the live animator himself or drawing his creation into being, only to witness the character slip the bonds of his control. And as part of the routinized script of these shorts, the animator would then eventually punish his creation for his disobedience and thereby reassert his control and draw the figure back into the inkwell from whence he came. In this sense, Salmon argues that the animated minstrel becomes a vestige of the commodity who speaks, the objected and abjected slave, and a stand-in for the animator as artist for hire. This is a scene of one of the famous animation studios in the 1920s. Over time, animators lost their prominent role as named and visible artisans. Their labor was routinized through a Fordist and Taylorist process that significantly sped up and streamlined, but also de-skilled the craft. At this point, the animator, or his disembodied hand, disappeared from the screen, and what was left behind, however, was an animated minstrel who continued to perform a compulsive ritual of rebellion and its suppression, only now without any visual reminder of the social and material relations that conditioned his disobedient performance in the first place. So in the foregoing history of animated minstrelsy, I suggest that we read modern industrial man's white gloves as a vestigial trope of blackface minstrelsy. In this sense, he is a figure who, like Mickey Mouse, carries the markers of minstrelsy without referring directly to the tradition itself. In so doing, he becomes a tense locus of contradiction between the American fantasy of self-invention and refashioning and its frustration and constraint. And while Orozco's figure is not animate, like the cartoon commodity who speaks, his identification as a racialized worker, a subaltern subject, may index Orozco's own concerns about the transformation of his art from a period when, during art form, in a period when the emergent culture industry of film and animation threatened the primacy of painting, and when the artist's labor was increasingly constrained by both the demands of publicness and the whims of corporate and private patrons. So Orozco had experienced the repetitive labor of industrial art when he was employed to hand paint movie posters during his first trip to the United States. He was deeply impoverished, couldn't get any work, and he ended up having to do industrial art just to make ends meet before going back to Mexico. Likewise, he'd also spent a considerable part of his career as an illustrator for satirical magazines, and during his time in the United States, he became acutely aware of the tribulations of the private art market as he found himself modifying the themes of his work to appeal to consumer tastes and developing a print career to supplement the slow work and low pay of mural painting. Even his murals were subject to the whims of patrons. While at Pomona, he had come up against moral censorship of the male nude, and at Dartmouth, in the midst of his project, he was embroiled in a public controversy over the content of his murals. At the very same time, Rivera's mural at Rockefeller Center was being whitewashed and eventually destroyed by his corporate patrons. And while Orozco's epic persevered, it was due to the support of his patron, Dartmouth College president Ernest Hopkins. For an artist who had, earlier in his career, extolled the public mural as the most disinterested form of art because, quote, it could not be made a matter of private gain or hidden away for the benefit of certain privileged few, end quote, coming up against the limits of private patronage in the U.S. was particularly unnerving. And I should just note this photograph of him painting live at the Museum of Modern Art. There's a famous quote. He was asked by someone at a dinner party, so what are you doing these days? And he says, I'm performing like a clown in a circus. in reference to the what he felt was the degrading experience of having to paint publicly. And I should note that this public performance was taking place within the context of a museum practice wherein they were bringing indigenous artisans in also to sort of perform their culture live for the kind of people you see watching with great interest in this photograph. So together, these experiences revealed to Orozco that, like the commercial or industrial artist, he was an artist for hire. He too was a commodity that speaks, a wage laborer who does not own the surplus value produced by his own work. Despite their anxious over-identification with the proletariat, muralists were no more industrial workers enslaved to the tailorist and Fordist mechanics of industrial time than they were wage slaves, or for that matter, actual slaves. So what does it mean that they so readily and eagerly identified with figures of subordination? Orozco may not have been an animator facing mechanical outmoding. However, the social and material relations encrypted within the plasticity of the animated character offer provocative ways to consider his expressive distortions of form, that is, his investment in expressionism as an aesthetic mode of freedom, of artistic freedom. So Scott Buchatman argues that despite its mode of production, animation also represented a poetics of freedom that is necessary for conceiving of revolutionary change. This dialectic, while most apparent in the industrial production of cartoon animation, also structures the production of high art. Buchatman explores the examples of Henri-Georges Clouzot's film of Pablo Picasso painting in Le Mystère Picasso from 1955, as well as Hans Nemeth's photographs of Jackson Pollock, executing his famous strip paintings. In these examples, he argues, quote, what begins as an avowed attempt to document the process of producing images instead become arenas for the image's liberation. Labor is superseded by a created world invested with a thoroughgoing animism, end quote. While Buchatman argues that the metamorphic nature of animated figures takes them beyond minstrelsy, opening up infinite possibilities of becoming that are denied racial caricatures, Salmon insists that because these characters were minstrels in their resting state, they thus, quote, always invoke the thingness lurking behind being human, that from which Americans were expected to transform themselves as they became American, end quote. In sensing the objected slave encrypted within the performance of freedom that metamorphosis entails, Salmons argues that bondage is the very condition of American freedom, and in this case, artistic vitalism. So in that sense, we might view Orozco's expressive aesthetic and working method, wherein a Dartmouth man morphs into a racialized worker in the shift from paper to plaster, as an index of the psychic conflicts of nation-state subjecthood in the Americas. By configuring cultural labor's discontents through the plasmatic form of the vestigial blackface minstrel, Orozco was giving voice to a racial structure of feeling that can only be read symptomatically by attending to the demetaphorized figure of the racialized worker. His status as a figure of freedom and possibility lies in his iconic capacities. However, as I've been arguing, he defies that status more than he embodies it. That is, I don't think what Orozco is attempting to do is to say we can solve the problem of exclusion in the immunitary state by just substituting a black person for a white person, and that fixes everything. It's compelling to read it that way, but I don't actually think that's what he's doing. His status, this figure's status as a figure of freedom and possibility, he defies the status of freedom and possibility more than he embodies it. He is more like the shadow of the lost object that haunts the national ego, a figure of reproach and self-denigration. Because we have to remember that Orozco painted this for a very particular audience. At that time was almost predominantly elite white men who would be in that space checking a book out and looking up at this figure and being expected to sort of grapple with him as a representative of American civilization. So this figure cannot be assimilated into the normative ideals of American identity. In that sense, he might be read as the, quote, Negro Indian of America's revolutions who haunts the white zombies in Anglo America. Haunting, Kana reminds us, quote, occurs at the moment when encryption is in danger of being deciphered. It does not merely call for inclusion, assimilation, reparation, or restitution. It calls for a response to the critical work of incorporation and the ethical demand that such incorporation makes on the future, end quote. If this is so, if the racialized worker is a specter of the exclusion yet retention of the racialized populations who found American freedom, The racial ambiguity of this figure forces the viewer to grapple with the question of racialization, just as Orozco likely was as a Mexican artist working in the United States, enjoying the privilege of his non-blackness while also confronting the exclusion of his racialized foreignness. Modern industrial man, then, is not a figurative subject, individual, or collective. He is a figure of community as relation. If community is nothing but the relation, the with or the between that joins multiple subjects, muses, exposito, it is a non-entity that precedes and cuts every subject, wresting him or her from identification with him or herself and submitting him or her to an irreducible alterity, end quote. In this sense, Esposito argues that melancholy is the very condition of community insofar as the term captures what Judith Butler calls precarious life. Life is precarious, she argues, because we are embodied, mortal, and therefore vulnerable and exposed to one another. Though we struggle for autonomy, vulnerability is what forges our relation in common. If we are to combat the immunitary impulse that arises from this relation, to keep from reproducing a vengeful, thanato-political regime in the name of security, we must convert our grief, that is, the mourning that results from suffering violence, into a resource for politics. Orozco seems to concur. In his melancholic recasting of the epic of American civilization, he calls upon the U.S. American subject to accept the limit of its condition of exceptional being as the originary obligation that unites modern Americans in communitas. As Wehelier puts it, quote, once suffering that results from political violence severs its ties with liberal individualism, this imagined autonomy, which would position this anguish in the realm of a dehumanizing exception, we can commence to think of suffering and enfleshment as integral to humanity. That is not the exception to what it means to be human, but actually integral to the conception of humanity, end quote. So by asking his U.S. American viewer to identify not with a liberal subject of Western history, Cortés, but rather with the pile of flesh that lays at his feet, Orozco challenges her to understand enfleshment as integral to humanity, to understand suffering as not the dehumanizing exception to liberal democracy, but the rule, and to reconceive political action from the standpoint of immunity to one that proceeds from an embrace of precarity. It is only from this place, a place of precarity, he suggests, that we can evade the thanato-political fate depicted on the wall and respond to the unanswered call for justice encrypted within the epic of American civilization. Thank you.